No? Yes, okay. Good evening, everyone, again. Thanks to Jim and Avner for having me. I'm a big fan of Cami and Stephan's work, so it's a great opportunity to discuss their recent paper. As Cami pointed out, right, they're basically contributing to our understanding of how individuals form expectations about the macroeconomy and the stock market. In earlier work, Stephan and Ulrike had shown that macroeconomic experiences affected people's expectation of the stock market and inflation. And in this paper, the authors basically ask, do individual sort of microeconomic experiences affect how people think, how people see the future in the stock market and the macroeconomy? The idea is, as Cami explained very well, sort of relatively straightforward, sort of people with low income or low education, sort of low socioeconomic status people, suffer from local thinking and basically end up forming beliefs that are too pessimistic by putting not enough weight on the good states of the world and overweighting the bad states of the world. They then go ahead and use individual survey responses on the stock market, business condition, and unemployment between 1978 and 2014 from the Michigan Survey of Consumers to basically test this idea. And as we have seen, sort of overall, right, beliefs are less pessimistic as sort of income increases or education increases. On the left was the result that Cami also showed. The probability that the stock market goes up over the next 12 months is rated too low by everyone, but it's rated sort of relatively higher by people with high income relative to people that have low income. The same is true for the expectation of the unemployment rate. And also, as Cami pointed out, sort of this difference actually is smaller during recessions when the good state is less relevant and therefore putting less weight on it becomes sort of less important, and we see a shrinkage of the difference between the low and the high income groups. They then go on and basically ask, do these beliefs that people have affect the decisions that they take? And for example, they find that a more pessimistic outlook on the stock market indeed sort of correlates with lower likelihood of participating in the stock market and relatively low investment. Sort of overall then concluding that these microeconomic experiences affect economic decisions in one way directly because these people are maybe poor and therefore cannot invest in the same way, but also indirectly because people have these potentially distorted beliefs about the stock market and the economy and therefore end up making certain decisions because of their biased beliefs. So I have a number of comments. The first one is going to be about how what a potentially really important contribution this paper can make. Then I'm going to be a little bit more critical and sort of try to understand what really we learn about the impact of socioeconomic status on beliefs and what alternative interpretations we might want to consider. And then if I still have time, I would like to talk about some policy implications that could come out of this. In order to tell you why I think this paper could be really important, I very briefly want to talk about another research project that you probably are all familiar with. This is Walter Mischel's Marshmallow Experiment, where he long time ago basically showed that the decision by 4-year-olds whether or not to consume a marshmallow that was in front of them right away or to wait a little bit to potentially consume 2 marshmallows, that decision by these 4-year-olds turned out to predict a lot of life outcomes such as college entry exams, college completion, marital outcomes, and so on. And I think one common interpretation of his research has been that patience and self-control are really important, and it was differences in patience and self-control that determined the decision of the 4-year-olds as well as all these later life outcomes. Okay? And that interpretation actually changed a few years ago when people at the University of Rochester essentially redid this experiment. But before giving kids marshmallows, they randomly assigned these 4-year-olds to 2 different treatment environments. They both met adults that promised them, I think, to get them some fancy pens that they could draw some pictures with. In the one setting, the adult never came back and actually never delivered these pens that they had been promised, so there was disappointment. And in the other setting, the adult actually did what he or she had promised, returned with the pens, and sort of as they sort of should have maybe expected. Then they take all these kids with these 2 different prior experiences and have them participate in this marshmallow experiment. And they find out that there's a striking difference with respect to the time that these kids are able to wait until they eat the marshmallow between the ones that had been in this unreliable environment where the adult didn't do what he or she promised, relative to the ones that experienced the reliable environment. Indeed, the ones that had the reliable experience before waited 12 minutes on average, while the kids, until they ate the marshmallow, and whereas the kids that experienced the unreliable environment could only on average wait 3 minutes. Thank you. And so basically the interpretation was that these beliefs that people formed based on their experience sort of made a lot of sense from the perspective of the kids and contributed heavily to their decision. And it basically sort of cast a lot of or it led to a reinterpretation of the earlier Marshmallow Experiment, suggesting that it's not just self-control and lack of patience, it could just be partly rational beliefs based on experiences that lead to these outcomes later in life. And I think something similar is basically potentially the contribution of this paper where Camille and Stephan and co-author basically show that the socioeconomic status predicts outcomes as we have known, and I'm focusing here on stock market participation, but that this relationship might not just be due to things that we have already understood, such as participation cost, risk aversion, trust, IQ, but it might also work its way through beliefs. And on the one hand, as Camille pointed out, that's important because these beliefs could be distorted and therefore sort of keep someone in poverty longer than they would otherwise be if they just made the right decision. But I think also important because it suggests we could actually intervene and sort of correct these beliefs probably or maybe more easily than we can correct someone's IQ or someone's risk aversion. Okay? So sort of now thinking a little bit about the results a bit more, but the first thing that the authors basically need to show is that socioeconomic status indeed sort of affects beliefs that people have. They start out by running a straightforward regression and indeed find that socioeconomic status significantly and positively correlates with beliefs. They obviously realize that there are many other reasons why this could be the case, and then differently from Camille's earlier paper sort of on the topic, here they actually have some individuals that are re-interviewed after 6 months. So they're basically able to consider this expression inverse differences and think about the changes in socioeconomic status affecting the changes in beliefs. And that, of course, takes care of a number of things. So at any omitted variable, this time invariant basically drops out. It also takes care of measurement error in the beliefs as long as these measurement errors are time invariant. But it also increases the measurement error in the socioeconomic status variable where you now basically rely on a 6 months period to identify sort of changes in income or socioeconomic status. When they do this, they still find a significantly positive relationship between the changes in socioeconomic status and beliefs, but the coefficient now is about 1/4 of the coefficient that they had found in the sort of levels regression. The authors in the paper just sort of assert that this is still a very big effect given the measurement error in socioeconomic status, and I think I would just like to see a little bit more sort of explanation of why we should think about this as a big effect. I thought of it as rather a smaller effect. But whatever the label is, I think this should be the number that you would actually ultimately use to calculate the indirect belief channel when you look at how socioeconomic status affects economic outcomes, because that seems to be the unbiased estimate. Sort of in another aspect, and I think is slightly more complicated to address, has to do with this question of what these beliefs represent. Right? The authors, and that's the interpretation I've taken so far, sort of think that people give them really their best guess at what the stock market will do or what the unemployment will do over the next year. And indeed, the survey questions are asked in that way. They refer to the stock market as a whole, the country as a whole. But it seems to me at least possible that in particular low socioeconomic status individuals might actually report an outlook that at least partially is the outlook for the local economy as opposed to the country as a whole. Right? They might be thinking about the local business conditions or even the returns of the local firms that they observe around them. You could actually test this by basically showing us whether or not the forecasts or the beliefs that people have do a better job in predicting what happens locally relative to what happens nationally. I think that this concern sort of goes a little further, and it could be that people actually mix into the expectations or beliefs that they state the beliefs and the outlook for their very own individual situation going forward. And you could, again, I think, test this, because what happens if people at time t-1 are particularly positive because they might actually expect that they get promoted in the next 6 months or next 12 months, then you would basically have, and that then happens on average, you would have that the error term at t-1 that drives this positive belief would turn out to be correlated with the socioeconomic status that we see 6 months later. So you could actually compare the estimate in your first difference regression that you have coming out of OLS with a GMM estimator where you would instrument for this change using past levels. And if indeed sort of there's an element where people are predicting their own situation going forward, then you would find that there's a difference between these two estimates. This very same point is basically related to what I think John Cochrane pointed out in his presidential address a few years ago. But in these types of settings, it could be that people are not stating sort of their best guess of the objective probability, but they effectively state what we could call a risk-neutral probability. So the subjective probability that sort of they answer in response to the question could basically be a reweighted objective probability where the reweighting basically happens with the individual pricing kernel or the individual change in marginal utility. Right? And basically what you get reported here is this probability star, which is the sort of objective probability times an individual's outlook of what his situation, his marginal utility is going to be in that state of the world. And then sort of quite naturally, you would have people that sort of put a lot of weight on the bad states of the world have subjective probabilities that are bigger because the bad state of the world is where marginal utility is particularly high, and that would put sort of naturally more weight on that particular probability. I think in all of these cases where you have either local or individual conditions driving some of the statements that some of the answers that people give you, at least in the cross-section, you would sort of get naturally correlation between their socioeconomic status and their beliefs. But I think even sort of more importantly, the question then is, I think you could have a situation where people give you incorrect beliefs for what you think they're answering, but at the end of the day, they actually give you they still arrive at the correct decision, because if you think about a situation where someone thinks about buying a car and considers unemployment going forward for this decision, then the national unemployment rate is one ingredient, but definitely that person needs to think about his or her condition with respect to experiencing unemployment. So at the end of the day, right, you need both of these elements, the local perspective as well as the sort of overall macroeconomic outlook, in order to make the right decision. And it could just be that people sort of don't separate the same way that we like to do this and just give us sort of the combined product already when we ask them. Obviously, we cannot know this, but it's, I think, a possibility that I would suggest you think about and try to address. And I think the same is true for stock market participation, where both the local conditions as well as the outlook as a whole would matter. Now, if I ignore what I just said and just sort of go with the idea that indeed people do try to give us their best guess for what the stock market is going to do over the next 12 months, and indeed they get this wrong, let's say because of their past experiences, then this actually suggests we could make them better off potentially by showing them how to form better or more correct expectations. And at least with respect to the stock market, we actually already have a tool that has done this. There's a very cool paper by Martin Weber and Christine Kaufmann in Mannheim that came out in Management Science a few years ago that tries to do exactly that. They basically ask people exactly that question: what is the probability that the stock market will go up over the next 12 months? In case you have been wondering, the answer for the US over the last 40 years is about 82%. And then they basically subject these people to different treatments. In the first treatment, they basically just give them summary statistic, mean volatility, and people sort of really don't update very much. They update a little bit, but not a whole lot. And then ultimately, they give them an environment where they can actually experience repeated draws from a distribution that looks like the US stock market. And they actually find that that experience sampling gets people sort of relatively close to what the correct answer would have been. And interestingly, at the same time, they asked people, how would you allocate in this experimental setting between risk-free and equity? And we did indeed see sort of the more they improve their projection of the stock market as a whole, the more they are willing to allocate towards equities. Thank you. And sort of the last point that I wanted to mention, so we are not the first ones to think about this, and I think Cami mentioned this. There's actually work by Bob Jensen at Wharton about returns to expectation. So he basically did a survey in the Dominican Republic and realized that a lot of the 8th graders sort of are too pessimistic with respect to the return of education. So he was able to convince someone in the Dominican Republic to randomly select a few schools, went into these schools, and educated students about the expected returns of education in an objective way. And then he sort of waited 4 years, and indeed, on the one hand, he found that the answers that people gave going forward were closer to the correct ones. And he also found that some of the kids decided to stay in school longer. This has led to a lot of debate, I'm being told by colleagues that work sort of on developmental economics, to whether or not we should do this. And unfortunately, not enough time has passed yet to know whether or not these kids are actually better off in terms of higher income and overall sort of better life situation. Let me skip all of that and sort of basically conclude that basically what Cami has shown us, that there is at least the potential that the individual economic circumstances, income and college, sort of distort individuals' beliefs and therefore affect their decisions about investing and about buying durables. This potential belief channel for sure has so far been largely ignored and under-researched, and so I think it's great that Cami and co-authors are looking at this. What I would like to see is a little bit more precision on how this belief channel, how big this indirect belief channel is, and just to think about alternatives that these beliefs could actually pick up. Thank you.